So, Be'ez Hashem, to explain a little bit, what is the idea of Asara? Why do we fast? Everyone knows that the simple reason why we're fasting Asara, the 10th of Teves, has to do with the laying of the siege and the surrounding of the walls, more of the surrounding of the walls that happened during the destruction of the first base of Mikdash, the first temple. But we have to understand a little bit what is specifically about the 10th of Teves, that it's such a strong and important time of fasting, so much so that the Avudraham brings a tradition from an older medrash that says the etzem, that has the word etzem, the essence appears, that word appears with regards to the 10th day of Tavis, when the Babylonians surrounded the walls of Yerushalayim and eventually conquered the land, conquered Jerusalem, and destroyed the first base of Mikdash. Since the word says essence, that even if theoretically, if Asara B'Tevis would fall out, the 10th of Tevis would fall out on Shabbos, we would fast on Shabbos. It doesn't fall out, the calendar doesn't work that way, that it ever falls out on Shabbos, but theoretically, just like Yom Kippur, all our other fasts are pushed off. This year, or for example, some other years, it even falls out on a Friday, and we fast on Friday. So it's a very harsh and strong celebration or commemoration. And we have to understand why exactly. So let's start off with the classic reading of the Rambam when he talks about Hilchos Tainus, the laws of Tainus, to understand what this is, to understand why we fast and what is it relevant and how is it relevant to our lives. So the Rambam begins, when he explains the idea of fasting, that he says there's a mitzvah in the Torah, there's a mitzvah of the Torah to lahazik l'ariba chatzoisros, to cry out and to wail through blowing of these trumpets. Al kol tzar v'tzar, and every time there's a hardship that Klal Yisrael is experiencing, we're experiencing something very harsh, al hatzibur, and it's a part of the collective, then there's a mitzvah to pray. That's min Torah. And the Rambam writes, this is part of the ways of tshuva, part of repentance, part of returning, part of changing our path of behavior, is to do this. And if we don't cry out, and we don't pray, and we say that the reason why we're suffering, or this particular thing that's happening in our lives, is just a mikra nikra, it's just a happenstance, nikra nikris. So the Rambam says, this person it's derech hachazaris, it's the path of an achzar. An achzar is someone that's cruel. Achzar comes from the word achzar, only foreign, which means a person is detached from life, detached from the experiences of life. And that creates more negativity. And then he continues and writes that Mediver Seifrim, according to the sages, in addition to crying out, there's also the idea of fasting. The fasting is Mediver Seifrim, the idea of the fast is from the sages, or Mediver Kabbalah, and it's on any harsh thing. That's what the Rambam writes in the beginning of Hilchos Tainus. Then later on, the laws of fasting in chapter 5, because we know that there are 4 general fast days that we have throughout the year. And then there's also Tainus Esther and Tainus B'charis, but generally there's 4 that's mentioned already in the Psukim and Tanakh. And the Rambam writes, Yesham Yamim Shekol Yisrael. There are days where all of Klal Yisrael fast because of the tzaras. She'ir b'hem, that the certain hardships that happened those days. So to Ma'or Alavav is to awaken us, to open us to the paths of tshuva, of changing our path. And because, like we said before, to understand that these are things that are caused by us, we're the agents of these things that are created in our lives. So if we do that, we also fast collectively. And these are zikar l'ma'asim haroim, amasav v'seinu shaykim v'seinu. This is so we should remember that sometimes our actions are similar to the actions of our ancestors that caused about, let's say we're talking about the destruction of the base of Mikdash, the first and the second base, particularly here with the first base of Mikdash, the first temple. And then the Rambam continues, Ad shegarim lahem ulonu oiseh hatzaras, until that deviant behavior or the fact that we weren't aligned in the highest level, that caused for them to experience hardship and also to us. And that's super important to understand. that when we're fasting, we're not only fasting for an event and a remembrance of things of past. So the reason why we're going to fast today, or we're going to fast on the 10th of Teves, for example, is to remember what happened thousands of years ago with the destruction of the temple. That's a commemoration, but that's not the reason why we celebrate holidays in general. Yom Tovim, Niskarim v'Nasim. These are memories that happen, continuous memories are happening in the present moment. Every year there's a recycling of that same energetic thing that opened up in the year of the miracle. In that particular time, it happens the same thing. And also the same thing with regards to fast days. It's not something we're only saying that happened in the past, but it's garam lonu. It caused us to experience some type of hardship. So now the question is, what is the tzara? What is the tzara that we're experiencing? Now, of course, we can say in a very simple level, of course, the destruction of the first base of Mikdash brought about eventually the destruction of the second base of Mikdash, and now we're still in exile and still in Golos. That's on a very, very high super level. But there's something more relevant into our directly into our lives, and specifically also since there were also the destruction of the second base of Mikdash. So you can always say that since we went back into Israel and we built the second base of Mikdash, so we should just commemorate the destruction of the second base of Mikdash, not the first, because after the first there was the second. And not only are we commemorating the destruction of the first base of Mikdash, which happens on Tisha B'Av or 10th of Av, etc., but we're saying that when the city was surrounded, that itself is a reason for us today, thousands of years later, to also fast. And it's a very serious, somber fast. So we have to understand, what is this? What's the tzara that we're experiencing in the present moment? What is the hardship and the difficulty that we're experiencing in the moment from that effect? Now, if we look at the slichas, which is the supplications and the certain prayers, the liturgy that we recite on the fast day of Asara b'Teves, you'll see that we mention that the three afflictions during the month of Tavis, that because of these three afflictions that happened during the month of Tavis, which is this month, the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th. This is what it says in the Slichas. This is what it says in the liturgy that we're commemorating. We're talking about the three events that happened, and the events that happened on the 8th, 9th, and 10th of Tavis. 10th, we all know what happened on the 10th of Tavis. It also says in the Psukim. So 10th we know is when the Jerusalem was surrounded for the first time, and then eventually it fell 6 months later, 5 months later, some months later during the month of Av. But what exactly is the 8th and the 9th and the 10th? What is this mystery of these 3 days? Again, this has to be something that's impactful into our daily life in the present moment. And what is that? So generally, there are 4 collective exiles. And this is a repetitive trope that appears itself in Chazal and Medrashim throughout. It appears right away in the beginning of the Torah, where the Torah talks about the time, the abyss, and the darkness, etc. The Torah refers to the 4 exiles. It talks about in the Bris Bein Absarim with the 4 exiles. And this is a repeated theme of the 4 grand, great, devastating exiles that the people, Klal Yisrael, will experience throughout history. How exactly the Galus Yishmol is a conversation that we had in the past, exactly how this fits into the 4 exiles. But there are 4 grand exiles. The first one is the Babylonian, the Persian, the Greek, and the Roman. And they also represent exiles within the people of Klal Yisrael themselves. And the first one is the time of the is the story of the Babylonian exile. What is the Babylonian exile? The Babylonian exile refers to the destruction of the first base of Mikdash, which was the story that we're talking about in Asara b'Teves, the destruction of the first exile. Then the Persians and the Babylonians were very close to each other. It's sort of where Iran and Iraq are today. So the Babylonians were in Iraq, and the Persians today is still in Persia and Iran. And then the Persian Empire, the rise of the Persian Empire, the Great Persian Empire, they overwhelmed the Babylonian Empire. And the Jews living in that part of the world that were living then in the Babylonian Empire began to be living in the Persian Empire. And the height of this Persian Empire is the story of the second exile, the second hardship that Klal Yisrael collectively experienced, which is the story of Haman, the story of Haman and Achashverosh, the famous story of Purim. This is the story of the Persian exile, or the Persian event. After 70 years, so the destruction of the first base of Mikdash is by the Babylonian exile, Babylonian kingdom, empire, and then the Babylonian Nebuchadnezzar was ardent, the generals, and they conquered the first base of Mikdash and destroy it, and that's the beginning of the exiles of the 10 lost tribes, etc. Then most Jews that were made from Judah and from Binyamin and from Levi were then exiled into Babylonia. They lived there. Then the Persian story happens. The rise of the Persian Empire overwhelms the Babylonian Empire, and the story of Purim happens. And 70 years later, after exile from the first base of Mikdash, the Persian emperor gives permission. Darius gives permission for Klal Yisrael to return back to Eretz Yisrael, to go back to Eretz Yisrael, and to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash. Principally, who is among the great sages, tzaddikim, and righteous people that went back with the Aliyah Shniya the second time they went into Eretz Yisrael, was Ezra. The Gemara says that Ezra was worthy that the Torah should be given by him, and etc. We should enter Eretz Yisrael, but it was given by Moshe Rabbeinu. Ezra was a great man, and Ezra was called Ezra HaSofer, the scribe. He's the one that finally canonized the Torah. He's the final writer of the Torah. Ezra he's the final writer. He's the great Sofer. Now, through Ezra and Nehemiah and others and the great tzaddikim that were living at that period of time, the second Beis HaMikdash was built. A few hundred years into the second Beis HaMikdash time period, there arose a new empire, a new great empire, which was the Greek Macedonian Empire, which was led by Alexander Mukden, the way Chazal call him. We call him, generally it's called Alexander the Great, who was the great conqueror. And he conquered most of the known world, and his rule enveloped most of the entire world, and he overwhelmed the Persian Empire at a famous battle, and he devastated the Persian Empire, and he overtook the Persian Empire, and the king of Egypt, etc. And also he went into Eretz Yisrael. There's famous stories in the Chazal where Alexander the Great meets Shimon HaTzadik. This is all during the time of the second Beis HaMikdash. One of the things that the Greeks, they were Macedonians, but they were part of Greece. One of the things that they were interested was to create a Hellenistic culture, which was a blend between some Greek theology and some philosophy, which they called Hellenism. And since the Greeks were then ruling Eretz Yisrael, in Israel also, unfortunately, some Jews got swept up into this new culture milieu and also became what was called Misyavanim. They became the Hellenists. Now, following the death, Alexander died a very young man. Following the death of Alexander the Great, his empire fractured and it was essentially divided into two. And Ptolemy was the first to control over Egypt. And then the Seleucid dynasty by another general, by Seleucid, was the dynasty to the other side of Israel, which is towards what we call today Syria or Assyria. So one was to the north of Israel, one was to the south of Israel. To the north of Eretz Yisrael were the Seleucids, and then and in Egypt to the south was Ptolemy. The Hanukkah story happens exactly during this time period, where there was a struggle between the ones that were keeping to the tradition, to the Messiah Torah, and to the values and ideals of the Torah, which were the Torah scholars and the tzaddikim that were living at the time. And then there was also the Greeks. There was the Greeks itself, and which were the Syrian Greeks, and also there were certain Jews, unfortunately, that were swept up in the same frenzy, and they were part of this universal Greek empire, indoctrination. And that was the argument. And that's the story of Hanukkah. Not to get further into the story of Hanukkah, but that's the story of Hanukkah. Then a few hundred years later, 27 years later, the second Beis HaMikdash was the Greek Empire eventually fell apart, and there was a new power in the world, which is the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire eventually entered into Eretz Yisrael in the year 70, Common Era, and destroyed the second base Hamikdash. They destroyed the second base Hamikdash, and that was the Roman exile. And Western civilization is considered a continuation, because the seat of Western civilization was then in Rome, and Western civilization even today is considered a continuation of the Roman Empire. That's still part of that same exile. That's the fourth leg. And the history of Klal Yisrael, the people of Israel, of Klal Yisrael, the past 2,000 years under the foot of the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire eventually divides itself into many different cultures, but it's still the part of what we call Western European civilization was a very harsh galus, still a harsh galus, which was a lot of repression and massacres and pogroms, and finally led to the terrible, devastating Holocaust. And then we still, unfortunately, are still continuing to experience, maybe even a rise of anti-Semitism and this propaganda, or even assimilation or secularism. These are all the affronts that, ever since the destruction of secular English, which is part of the Roman exile. Now, this is all externally based. So these are four mighty empires that inflicted tremendous havoc and exile to Klal Yisrael. Again, beginning first base of English, the first temple, which is destruction to the Babylonian Empire, then the story of the Persian Empire, the story of Purim, and then the Greek Empire, the Greek Assyrian Empire, and the story of Hanukkah, and then the destruction of the second base of English, which was still in the effects of that through the Roman Empire. And then there is also a more internal fractionalization, an internal dissension that happens within Klal Yisrael itself. And this begins to show up in very stark way during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash, during the time of the second Beis Hamikdash period, which was the time also of the rise. It was the end of the prophecy, because Chag Malachim was the beginning of the second Beis Hamikdash, was the end of prophecy. And then there was the rise of the sages, the rise of first the Zugus, and then even Shimon HaTzadik, which is the beginning, that's Mashiach, the end of classic, no, that's the beginning of the rise of the Greek Empire, the parallel between Greece and Yerushalayim. And within Klal Yisrael, there was a certain erosion, a certain fractionalization that happened within the collective people of Klal Yisrael. Even 500 years later, this situation continued. If you know a little bit of the story of what happened to Klal Yisrael during the Second Temple period, but even later, when Chazal established, originally it was created by Anshe Knesset but they added another tefillah to Shemona Esrei, to the 18th, they added an 19th prayer, or it was maybe 17th, it was the 18th. And the Gemara speaks about this in Brachos 28, but the idea that was an added tefillah, and that was created, Lamalshinim, it's the added called the Lamalshinim, and the informers. And a special prayer was said to signal out the informers within Klal Yisrael, something that was eroding the unity, that was eroding the cohesiveness within the people of Israel themselves. There were certain malshinim. Who are these malshinim, these informers that we still pray against them? This is the idea these are those were people that were actually Jews that were informing the Roman authorities against their brethren. And this was some type of real problem that was experiencing. If you look at some of the older versions of this, some of the older versions of this particular davening, this particular prayer, you'll see that sometimes they used to say Lamalshinim, also Lamalshinim, we said Umishumadim, and those who denounce their practices of Torah mitzvahs, or the Tzdukim, the Sadducees, he used to say Tzadukim, or also the Natzrim, the Nazarenes, the followers of Yeshua Natzri, of Christianity, which then many were Jews, and most of them were not Jews. All of them in the beginning were all Jews, and who claimed that their leader was the Messiah, was Mashiach. And these were fractions that began to erode and to make inroads within the unity of Klal Yisrael. There was a certain sense of cohesiveness, certainly in the time of the prophets, and even the beginning of the time of the second Beis Hamikdash. There was a cohesive way of practice, and then there was dissension and division within the practices, within Judaism, within the practice of Yiddishkeit itself, and that's the time of the Malshinim, Mishumadim, and then L'Natzrim. That's the time that this tefillah was created. Now, getting back to the 3 harsh days, we said that in the Slichas, it speaks about the the three harsh days, the 9th, the 10th, and the 7th. What are these events? So on the 8th of Tavis, it says that the 8th of Tavis is the day that the Torah, and this was said already in Megillus Tainus, on the 8th of Tavis was the day that the Torah was written, translated into Greek, which we call the Septuagint. And it was the days of Ptolemy II, the king that was, again, from Egypt. And then the darkness, this is the way it's written in Megillus Tainus, this ancient scroll, which is one of the roots of what we have from Hanukkah, the story of Hanukkah. The darkness descended upon the world for 3 days when the translation of the Torah happened. We know the Gemara says that they were forced, and they were forced to translate the Torah. And this idea is recorded in Shulchan Aruch. This idea that the Greek forced them to write the Torah into Greek, as mentioned in Shulchan Aruch, Arachaim, in 580, the Shulchan Aruch and Tavkuf, that the idea of the 8th day was the day that the Torah was translated. The 10th of Tavis, we know, is when the Babylonian king camped and surrounded Yerushalayim and placed the city under siege. This is what happened on the 9th of Tavis. But then the Shulchan Aruch continues, the Beis Yosef, the author of the Shulchan Aruch continues, regarding the 9th, it is not known what caused the trouble that happened on it. That we don't really know what that day is. So we know what the 8th is, which is this translation turned to Greek, and we have to understand what is the issue. We know the 10th is when the Yerushalayim was in siege, but the 9th is a mystery, or Beis Yosef is choosing not to disclose and to reveal exactly what happened on the 9th. We'll have to understand why, but he's choosing not to. In the Ashkenazic, which is the German version / German French, but really the older German version of the Slichas, it says that on the 9th of Tavis, in the year, which is also, we know is the year 3448, which is 313 before Common Era, BCE, is the day that Ezra HaSofer passed away. That he passed away on the 9th. In the Sephardic Slichas, incidentally, it says that he passed away on the 10th. But in the Ashkenazic version, it says that he passed away on the 9th of Tavis. And so we know, again, as we said before, was the leader of Klal Yisrael when they entered into Eretz Yisrael. So his death would make sense that his death, the day of his passing, marked a very important time for the people, that especially they just had this euphoria of building the second base of Mikdash, and he was this great Jewish sage and leader and a big Leichem Mechemes Hashem, and then he passed away on the 9th of Tavis. That's what it says in the version of the Ashkenazic version of Slichas. There's other sources, older sources, that's mentioned already in Rishonim, that the 9th of Tavis is the birthday of the founder of Natzrus, the birthday of Yeshua Natzri, the founder of Christianity. So obviously these could both be true, that Ezra passed away and that was his birthday. That we have to understand what these events are and how they correspond to each other. So even if we have four events. You have Ezra passing away. You have the birth of Natzrus. You have the birth of Yeshua Natzri. You have the translation into Greece, and you have the story, which is the more famous story, what happened on the 10th of Tavis, which is the idea of the siege of Yerushalayim. So these are 4 events. To understand what they are, why they're related to the 8th, 9th, and 10th, and why we still commemorate them in terms of fasting and to express the Lano Asara, like the Rambam writes, to us a hardship. We'll understand them in terms of understanding these ideas as some type of a schalta de purnasum. This is like the beginning of that paved, like a beginning of a negative opening that paved the way and had an effect on Klal Yisrael throughout history. Had a negative effect in terms of hardship and experiences. So we said there are 4 exiles, and the first one is the Babylonian and the Persian. The second one is a Persian. So the 10th of Tavis, we're going to say these events, these 4 things that we speak about, these are also going to be connected to the 4 exiles as well. So the 10th of Teves, the way it's celebrated, the way it's commemorated, as when the city was besieged. This opened up, of course, later for the Emperor Nebuchadnezzar to breach the walls and eventually destroy the Beis Hamikdash and put it ablaze, which is the story of Tisha B'Av, and which therefore led directly the siege around Yerushalayim, surrounding Yerushalayim on the 10th of Teves, led directly to the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash. And like we mentioned before, the Persians, which were the neighbors of the Babylonians, overwhelmed the Babylonian kingdom, and the Jews that were living then in Babylon became subject to the Persian exile, and to the Persian kingdom, to the Persian emperor. And that story is the story of Purim. So the dispersion of Klal Yisrael, what happened through the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, for the first temple, is exactly what Haman, who comes in front of him, who comes in front of Achashverosh and says, there's a nation that's spread out, who has a different faith and is spread out and dispersed throughout the people. So the event of Asara b'Tavis, the event of the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, and when Klal Yisrael went into exile for the first time, which means they were dispersed throughout the lands, throughout the earth, up until Espanola, till the edges of the world, they knew the edge of the world to Spain, which we know that Jews were sold into slavery during the time of the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, and they ended up in parts of the world that were like the edge of the world, like Spain. This is directly related to this, that the destruction or the siege that was laid on Asara b'Teves is directly related to both the Babylonian exile, very clearly, because that's the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, and eventually also to the Persian exile. If you look in Megillas Tavis, which is the text that we mentioned before, this scroll of days that we're supposed to fast, and that's days that we're supposed to spell things that happened in those days, it says that on that the month of Tavis it says that the king of Persia took to Esther, which the Gemara also mentions this, in the month of Tavis. The pasuk says that in the Megillah, but it's singled out in Megillas Tavis as that date in the month of Tavis because it's directly related to the siege or to the surrounding of Yerushalayim that happened on the 10th of Tavis. So the 10th of Tavis is the Aschalta de Perus. So that's the beginning of this hardships that happened that Klal Yisrael was still suffering under, which is the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash, and the devastating effects of the destruction of the first Beis Hamikdash was the dispersion of Klal Yisrael. That Klal Yisrael was no longer a unified people living in a unified space, but they were dispersed throughout all the ancient world and eventually throughout the entire planet. That is what we're talking about when we speak about that Asara b'Teves, the day of Asara b'Teves, the day of the 10th of Teves. That is the tzara, the hardship that we're still experiencing, the galus that we're still experiencing, the exile that we're dispersed throughout the world. On the 8th of Tavis, like we said, the 8th of Tavis is the day that, like we mentioned before, that the Torah was translated into Greece the first time, the Septuagint, and darkness descended onto the world for 3 days. The Gemara also mentioned this, the Gemara Megillah, and there's a Gemara in Masech Sofrim and Masech Sefer Torah, and it says like this, that there were 70 sages who translated the Torah into Greek. I think Ptolemy asked them to translate. And we know that it was through a HaKadosh because they changed the verses. The Gemara says Megillah, Bereshis, Bar, Bereshis, etc. They changed things to make sense. And even though we're sitting in separate rooms, separate spaces, they were able to translate exactly according to the Ruach HaKodesh, according to divine wisdom, to translate it correctly. And the Gemara over there says, in Masech Sofrim, the Gemara says that day was difficult, it was hard. Kashalam, Yisrael, it was hard, it was difficult for the people of Israel, like the day in which the golden calf, the Egel Azav, was created, was fashioned. Because the Torah was not able to translate fully. This is what it says in Chazal. So it was a hard day because the Torah, it was a day as if the day that the Egel, the golden calf, was fashioned. Now, this seems to be like a terrible thing about translation, almost like the day the Egel was created sounds like a terrible thing. The Egel, the golden calf, was created. But on the other hand, when it says that Moshe was sitting on Be'er's Torah, that Moshe was translating the Torah, was explaining the Torah. So Rashi brings down that Moshe was translating the Torah to 70 nations. it's the beginning happens Chodesh Shvat, that's the day that he started translating Torah, and that's seen as that the translation was not such, God forbid, a horrific event. Rather, on the contrary, it was a project. It was part of the Matan Torah, part of the giving of the Torah. That part of the wisdom of the Torah was the wisdom of the Torah should reach to all four corners of the world and penetrate all languages. That the spiritual wisdom, the transcendent wisdom of Hashem that was revealed to Torah on Matan Torah should reveal to the world. That seems to be a very positive thing. And here we're saying this other Gemara says in Masechet Sofrim that it's Kashal Am Ki Yisrael. It's very difficult to call Yisrael as the day that the Egel was created. So what is it? Is it a terrible thing to translate? Is it a good thing to translate? And then we say that's the 8th day of Tavis. Is the hardship of that? So we said that this Gemara is also mentioned in Megillah, and then later the Gemara says in Megillah, the Gemara says that. Where it describes the translation of the Torah by the 70 sages, that each one had Ruach HaKodesh and they were able to translate it correctly. And then the Gemara says that Rav Shimon Gamliel says that a person is allowed to write a Sefer Torah. You're allowed to write a Sefer Torah that's translated into Greek. And the Gemara says this is the halacha, this is the opinion, that we're allowed to translate the Torah, we're allowed to write the Sefer Torah, into Greek. What's the reason? So Bechel explains what's the reason for Shimon Gamliel, because he brings on a pasuk that it says that Hashem will enlarge to Yefes, and Yefes is an allusion to Yavam, and Ba'al Hashem, the Yishka Ba'al Hashem, that the beauty of Yefes is also connected to the beauty, one of the children of Noach, that the beauty of Yefes, which is the forefather of Yavam, is Yefes is connected to beauty. The Yoifi, the beauty of Yefes, shall be in the tense of shame. That means that you translate the Torah. That means that theoretically, a person could write a Sefer Torah, which is the most sacred object that we have. Sefer Torah, it's the most precious thing that we have, and it could be written not only Ksavashuri, in the language that we write in the sacred language, like the Gemara explains in the beginning of Sanhedrin and Avchot Beis, the different opinions, but the idea of Ksavashuri was the original language, or certainly the language that always was, according to most opinions. And so not only can you write in this language, but you also learn to write into Greek. Now, the halacha, just to be clear, the Rambam writes that we don't have pure Greek anymore. We don't have that language anymore. It's lost, and therefore we can't do it. But theoretically, so it could be that the reason why it can be translated into Greek and it can be written in Greek and it becomes a sacred text. The Rambam Pirush Mishnayos writes in that Megillah says the Rambam says because it was since it was already translated by the sages in the Septuagint, by the 70 sages, and it's a language that are familiar amongst Jews and amongst the sages, so therefore it can be translated. But there's something deeper over here, obviously, that it can be translated specifically into Greek. And that's another conversation, why exactly into Greek, but that's, even technically we can't do it today. So here we see that if we say that the Yefes, the beauty, should be all shame, should be in the tense of shame, which means that it seems like it's a positive thing, the translation into Greek. And here and on the other hand, we're saying that it's kasha, it's the hard day, as if the day that the Egel was created. So it seems like it's a very difficult day. So what is the answer to this question? When it says that something, it was hard as the day of the making of the Egel, the creating of the Egel, and there's 2 days. One day, Aaron, the Klal Yisrael created the Egel on one day, and they only served the Egel the next day. When they got up in the morning, they served the Egel. So there's two separate things. There's the potential of something, where it's just created, but that hasn't yet been served, and then the way it was served. So when they were creating, and it's a distinction. When they were creating the Egel, or the sheaf, or the desire to create the Egel, like the Ezra writes and the Kuzri writes, this didn't come from a negative space necessarily. They wanted someone, since they needed someone, something tangible. Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe was no longer there. The person Moshe that they brought us out was no longer there. So they were asking, instead of experience Hashem as in the intangible or the transcendence, they needed some type of image to which to relate through the tangible to the intangible, through the form to the formless. But what happened? This is what happened on the day that they created the egel, which means it wasn't necessarily avodah zarah. There's a sikha from the Rebbe also about this idea. It wasn't necessarily avodah zarah. When it happened avodah zarah was the next morning when they say Ayel Kach Yisrael. That the day it was fashioned was just potentially negative, but not essentially. It wasn't absolutely that's what's going to be, because they just asked for an image, a conduit to replace the presence of Moshe, which was not necessarily a negative thing. They weren't worshiping an idol. They just wanted a medium, like you said, to go from the tangible to the intangible, from the immediate to the transcendent. But what happened the next day is that they looked at it and said, "So this is in fact the God." So this is, if we understand this medrash correctly, we understand this idea of the fashioning versus the service, the worship, we can understand what's the issue with translation. The actual translation itself, of course, is not a terrible thing. In fact, maybe that's part of the project of, like we see from Moshe Rabbeinu, that's part of the entire idea of to translate the Torah into all different languages, that the Torah should permeate and be revealed in every single corner of the world. The holy sacredness of the Torah should be revealed in any particular world. The problem is that the day after, because once you have something in translation, then it becomes a certain accessibility to text that can lead people that are readers of the text, that are not guided correctly from the Messiah, that don't possess the correct humility to the text, that they can start to do things on the next day. So there's the illusion that, okay, if I have already the text and I have everything in translation, I don't need a living teacher. I don't need a guide. I don't need someone to tell me how to read this. Because anyone can just pick up the text and read it. And that is the possibility of opening up to the idea of the Greek exile. So the first one, Asara is connected to the Babylonian and Persian Empire exile, and the Tavis, is connected to the translation. This is connected to the Greek exile. What was the Greek exile? The Greek exile was, the Greeks were philosophers. Alexander the Great was a student of Aristotle. And every single thing of philosophy every single thought, some people say, is a footnote to Aristotle. The Aristotelian philosophy is the bedrock of Western civilization and Western thought. The Greeks were not against the philosophy of Torah. The Greeks were against the transcendence of Torah. The Greeks were lashkichem Torah secha. They didn't want that we should connect to the Torah as the living Torah that's connected to the living God, to the transcendence. They loved the Torah. Even the Hellenistics, the Hellenized Jews that lived in Eretz Yisrael also studied the Torah. We see this with Achar and his mother and a connection to Torah. She said she saw yeshiva and she saw people learning. She said, I want my son to be the same way. But it says also that the songs of the Greeks were always on her lips, which means that there was a certain attraction, a lure to the wisdom, to the beauty, to the yoifi HaTorah, the beauty of the Torah, as a philosophical text, as an intelligent text. But the exile caused this tremendous dissension that happened within Klal Yisrael, and eventually the clash between these civilizations was a clash between intellectualism, rationalism versus transcendence. Not that the transcendence is the absence of rationalism, but it's a sense of intelligence that is connected to something that's transcendent, connected to a Messiah, connected to revealing of Sinai, connected to Asher B'Chabonu, and Nois Torah that we understand as a Nois Torah, that's a continuous giving of the Torah, something that's being revealed from Sinai that's continuously occurring. So what begins with Moshe initiating the translation will eventually be revealed. Loss and love, will come a time when there won't be the clip, there won't be the negativity of that, and the world will be permeated with Torah. But the danger of the translation of Torah, that's why it's a schalta de permissive. It's not a negative thing in and itself, but it brought about for a certain way of learning the Torah, that the Torah, when we say every single day, and we say, I'm sorry, when we say that there's a tshuva shlema that we should return to tshuva, a complete tshuva. We're talking about the Torah should be revealed in its transcendent glory. This is the danger of translation. Of course, we have to translate and we have to, spread the words of Torah throughout the entire world, but it always has to come with a sense that that we need a living teacher, a teacher that resembles an angel, a teacher that's connected to a sense of transcendence, and we're part of the Messiah, part of revealing. Otherwise, it becomes another intellectual idea, and everyone owns it, and you can do whatever you want with it. That's the Torah going into exile. This is what happens on the 8th of Tavis. So there's Klal Yisrael's experience exile through the dispersion, through the movement, and throughout the entire world. That's the 10th, and that's connected to the Persian and to the Babylonian exile. And then there's also this idea that happens on the 8th, which is connected to this dissension and this fragmentation that happens on the level of Torah, where the Torah is translated into various different languages, also represents this idea that it's no longer necessarily connected to something that's transcended. That's the caution, that's the hardship, that it could turn into an idol. It could turn into something that is exactly contrary to what the Torah actually really is. And then we have the 9th of Teves, which, like we said, the Shulchan Aruch doesn't say what it is. It seems like it's a mystery, but really, the misuse is really hiding something. Yosef is hiding it. It's not saying it clearly, especially because they lived in that particular time period. It's the same reason that the Rebbe says why he doesn't talk about Shavitz Ben Noach and why the Rambam does. And this has to do with the Roman exile and the birth of the founder of Natzrus of Christianity. Eventually, the Roman Empire, as we know, accepted that as the religion of the empire. And it became the embodiment of Rome. Rome became the seat of power and the seat also of Christianity. And the effects of that event, the effects wasn't in the birth in itself, but the effects of that event was the harsh and chaotic and very, very difficult exile that we experience collectively throughout the history of Jews living in Europe, living under the rule of the Roman Empire, which is the embodiment also the idea of Natzrus. Now, the birth in itself of this individual is not itself something negative. A person is born, especially he was a Jewish boy, and he was born born with a pure soul. And even when he grew older, it's not necessarily something that it was connected to him. It's something that was created by his followers, and it's a whole shmooze on its own, a whole conversation on its own. That maybe it was Shem Shemayim, Shalom Tarshish was done into poems, and it was done intentionally to separate. But what happened from it, the outgrowth of this movement, was tremendous hatred, massacre, torture, crusades, pogroms, which is all an offshoot of this idea. It was a schalte de parnus. It was the beginning of a very harsh exile that unfortunately was still suffering from this point. This is connected to the 9th of Tavis, and also connected with the threat or the hardship that happened within Klal Yisrael itself, and that's connected specifically to the death of Ezra, so for the end of prophecy and the beginning of the rise of Natzrus. This particular time. So again, Ezra was the great prophet, the leader of Klal Yisrael. He gathered the nation together. He brought the people from all the Babylonian exile, he brought them all together, and he helped them return to their homeland. He helped them return to Eretz Yisrael. He assisted them in finishing the second base of English and building it. It began already before him, but he completed it. He connected everyone to their Jewish roots, and it's like it begins the whole story in Ezra, where he tells them they have to marry Jewish women and they have to be committed to the Yiddishkeit. And he creates this renaissance of tshuva. And then he passes away. And a very short time after he passes away, starts this incohesiveness, this breaking apart with groups within Klal Yisrael, a certain type of divisive movements that created a lot of friction and fraction within Klal Yisrael. First, it was the Malshinim, the Shumadim, the Natzrim, and the Tzedukim, and the all different types of groups that were rising, and it created fractions within Klal Yisrael. So when Ezra passed away, and then Chagai, Schai, Malach, and the prophets passed away, that's when the Ruach HaKodesh passed away. That's when that's when that era of cohesive revelation was passed away. The age of prophecy passed away. It was the canonization of text. That was the end of the Kisei HaKodesh that were written. The final books of Ksuvim were finally canonized. The Shir Hashir or Kehelis were finally made part of Chavdal Kisei HaKodesh. And that was that period. It was a time when there was a revelation from above. Hashem spoke, we listened. Ezra's not even called a rabbi, it's called a scribe. He's transcribing the words from above. And this is the beginning of Torah Sheba'al Peh. This is the beginning of the oral tradition, the age of the sages, the age of debate, the age of where the below having been saturated and imbued with revelation from above for so many years now became our turn. The revelation started coming from below. And that's what happened during this time period. This time period of Shimon HaTzadik, who was a student of Ezra, like the Rama writes in the Akdama. And as long as they were alive, there were still miracles that were happening. The Chazal speak about the time of Shimon HaTzadik, the miracles that occurred in the Beis HaMikdash. There's Yerushalmi and Yuma, and the Gemara says also the same thing. The things were done in a beautiful way, and Lechem Aponim was always fresh, and there was miracles that were revealed. That's the beginning of it. Then that ended, and the Torah now became a received Torah that no longer revealing from above. Now became the zugas and the conversation and the times in the Mishnah, and that's when you have the rising of the below, so to speak, the rising of Klal Yisrael. That's when we had all this internal turmoil. And in times of Ating B'Sei, which is Shimon HaTzadik's student, that's the beginning where we see that the rising of the tzedukim, of the groups of the heretics, and this is the breaking apart of almost of the Torah. The Torah became, the Chazal say that in the beginning of the times of the debates first there were less debates between Bisham and Hillel, only 3 debates, but then it says because the students of Bisham and Hillel did not sufficiently study, humility, receive from their teachers, that created the machlokes, that created the dissension, that created the arguments. And the Torah became chas v'shalom like kishnei Torahs. The Torah itself became like many Torahs, and then it developed even further. The Jews were dispersed throughout the world, and then there was differences between Ashkenazi custom and Sephardic custom or the Italian customs, and the Torah became chas v'shalom like the two Torahs, like many Torahs, and how exactly we do things and how everything is done. So this splintering apart within the Torah happens precisely with the death of Ezra and Shimon HaTzadik in that period. And then there's the rise of the Mishumadim and the rise of the Tzdukim, the Sadducees, and the rise of the Natzrus, and that created a dissension, a time period of difficulty within Klal Yisrael that we're still suffering. This disunity between Klal Yisrael, this disunity between the people of Israel in terms of the way we understand things and we learn things. Not that everyone has to learn exactly the same. That's not the point. The point is that it becomes such arguments that it can actually create strife and hardship. And this is what the 9th of Tavis is. So all in all, when in Slichas it speaks about the 3 harsh days of the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th, we understand that these 3 days, and this is why Lanu Atzaras, and these are days that are connected to us, hardships that are connected to us. We understand that these are days that affects us still today. The fact that we're dispersed throughout exile, which represents the idea of the 10th, and the fact that the Torah itself went into exile, and the Torah Shlema, the Torah is no longer complete in its full glory. We don't have the fullness of the Torah, and the Torah is broken apart. And within Klal Yisrael, there's dissension. Within Klal Yisrael, there's division. So there's division in Torah, there's division of people, there's division within ourselves. All this comes with the 8th, the 9th, and the 10th of Tavis. This is Das Chatad. Of course, As we're entering close to the time of Mashiach, when Yom Simcha, these days will be transformed. These days will be transformed in days of happiness and joy. And Be'ez Hashem, already this year, we should not have to fast and not have to mourn for all these terrible things that we're still in exile, we're still experiencing division and separation between ourselves, within the Torah, between our people, living different parts, but all connected, that we should reach a point that we don't have to experience this, and through coming and revealing of Mashiach, and these days will turn into days of joys and happiness.